For many centuries, scholars focused far more attention on the peoples of Western and Southern Europe than on the populations of the eastern half of the continent. Yet the Slavs eventually came to make up an enormous part of Europe's population, and their rise is one of the most important developments in the history of the region. What makes this especially striking is how late they appear in written history. Classical Greek and Roman authors described Celts, Germans, Scythians, Sarmatians, and many other peoples in considerable detail, but they left no clear and direct account of the Slavs during the early periods. This absence was not accidental. The formation of the Slavs as a distinct ethnic and linguistic community seems to have taken place later than that of many neighbouring peoples, and it unfolded in regions far from the centres of Mediterranean civilization. These lands lay deep in Eastern Europe, beyond the usual horizon of the ancient world, in territories that merchants and explorers reached only occasionally. The ancient Greeks knew mainly the southern reaches of what later became the Slavic world, especially the lands around the northern coast of the Black Sea. They identified these regions through the peoples they encountered there, above all the Scythians and Sarmatians. Greek colonies had been founded along the Black Sea shore as early as the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, and from these coastal settlements some Greeks pushed inland along the great rivers in search of trade. Even so, reliable records of those journeys were limited. The earliest substantial description came from Herodotus in the 5th century before Christ. He travelled to Scythia and reached Olbia near the mouth of the Dniester. Although he did not go farther into the interior, he gathered a great deal of information from local informants and included it in his history. For a very long time, his account remained the main source of ancient knowledge about Eastern Europe. Herodotus understood that beyond the southern grasslands stretched immense forests and river systems. He knew the major rivers flowing into the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and he also described the Persian campaign of Darius against the Scythians, a dramatic but unsuccessful military expedition. Alongside the Scythians themselves, he mentioned many other peoples living around them. To the west were the Agathyrsi, associated with wealth and gold. To the north lived the Nuri, a mysterious people whose name has sometimes been linked to places in later Eastern Europe. Herodotus reported that they once fled their homeland because of swarms of snakes, and he also recorded the strange belief that at certain times they transformed into wolves. This detail almost certainly reflects very old traditions of werewolf belief, which survived in Eastern Europe for centuries. Farther east and north, he placed other shadowy groups such as the Budini, a fair-haired people living by hunting in the forest zone, and beyond them he knew almost nothing except empty and distant lands. These early descriptions are valuable, but they do not provide firm proof for the existence of the Slavs as a clearly identifiable people. Some historians have tried to connect the Slavs with tribes like the Nuri or the Budini, yet such links remain uncertain. Similar debates surround the Venedi, a large population known to Roman and Greek writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Christian era. The Venedi were said to live beyond the Vistula, between the Baltic coast and the Carpathians. Because later sources sometimes used a similar name for early Slavic groups, many scholars once saw them as direct ancestors of the Slavs. Even so, the problem is not settled. Ancient writers themselves were unsure whether the Venedi should be associated with Germanic peoples, Sarmatians, or some other population altogether. Their way of life, including settled homes and movement on foot, set them apart from nomadic, steppe peoples. But that alone does not resolve the question of identity. Ptolemy added more information in the 2nd century. On his map, the Venedi occupied a broad region east of the Vistula and extended toward the Baltic. He also mentioned another puzzling name that some later scholars tried to connect with the Slovenes, though the evidence is weak. These references encouraged generations of researchers to search for the ancient homeland of the Slavs in the lands north of the Carpathians and east of the Vistula. Still, names in ancient geography are often deceptive. A tribal name could shift, survive in altered form, or be applied by outsiders to peoples who did not use it for themselves. That is why it is impossible to identify the early Slavs simply by matching names from classical texts with later medieval peoples. The Romans never established lasting control over the heart of Eastern Europe, though they approached it more than once. Under Augustus, Tiberius, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, Roman armies pushed toward the regions that later became central to Slavic settlement. Marcus Aurelius even campaigned deep into the lands north of the Danube and spent time near the territory of modern Slovakia. Yet Rome never secured permanent dominion there. The planned northern provinces were never fully created, and the empire gradually shifted from expansion to defense. In the end, the Western Empire collapsed under the pressure of migrations and invasions, while the Eastern Empire continued as Byzantium. It was only at this stage, when the old Roman order in Central and Southeastern Europe was beginning to weaken, that the Slavs entered the historical stage in large numbers. The first explicit mention of the Slavs under their own name appears only at the beginning of the 6th century. From that point onward, Byzantine writers began to describe them much more clearly. Procopius and Jordanes became the main witnesses. Procopius, writing from the Byzantine world, described the movements of Germanic tribes and noted that the Slavs already occupied wide stretches of Central Europe. His reports suggest that by the early 6th century they had spread into lands north of the Middle Danube, though not all those territories were yet fully settled. He also recorded episodes in which Germanic leaders sought refuge among Slavic groups, implying that Slavic communities were already established in regions close to present-day Slovakia and Moravia. These notices are important because they show that the Slavs had already become a major force, even if they reveal little about where they had lived before. Jordanes, who also wrote in the 6th century, added that the Slavs were a numerous people living across a vast area and divided into several branches. He distinguished between the Sclaveni and the Antes, placing them in the broad zone between the Vistula, the Dniester, and the lower Danube. His description captures a moment when the Slavs had already begun to move out from an earlier homeland and spread into the territories where they would remain throughout the Middle Ages. Yet even Jordanes does not fully solve the question of origins. His account belongs to a time when the expansion had already begun. It tells where the Slavs were in his own age, not how they had first formed. Language offers another path into this problem. The Slavic languages belong to the Indo-European family, together with Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Greek, Iranian, Armenian, Albanian, and others. Linguistic comparison shows that Slavic developed relatively late as a separate branch. In fact, it appears to have been one of the youngest major Indo-European divisions. For that reason, the earliest Slavs seem to have spoken a very unified language for a long time. Between the 6th and perhaps the 9th or 10th century, a broadly common Slavic speech was used from the Baltic to the Aegean and from the Elbe to the Dnieper, with only limited regional differences. Only after the Slavs had spread across a huge territory and founded distinct political communities did the separate West Slavic, East Slavic, and South Slavic languages emerge more clearly. Linguistic evidence also shows which peoples were closest to the early Slavs. Their strongest relationship is with the Baltic languages, suggesting that there was once a very close Balto-Slavic connection. After that come ties with Germanic and Iranian languages, followed by lesser but still significant links with Celtic, Illyrian, and Thracian. This pattern points to the setting in which Slavic developed. The early Slavs must have lived in a region bordered by Baltic peoples to the north, Germanic groups to the west, Iranian-speaking populations to the east and southeast, and Celtic, Thracian, or Illyrian groups farther south. Place names, especially river names, strengthen this picture. The oldest, clearly Slavic hydronyms are concentrated between the Oder and the middle Dnieper. This suggests a homeland north of the Carpathians, stretching through parts of present-day Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Even so, language alone cannot provide exact dates. For that, archaeology becomes essential. Over the last century, archaeologists have reconstructed the cultural history of the regions associated with early Slavic development in remarkable detail. But archaeology has its own limits. Material cultures can be mapped and described with precision, yet linking them to a specific people is much harder. Pottery styles, burial customs, and settlement forms do not carry ethnic labels. They reveal contact, exchange, adaptation, and continuity, but not identity in a simple or automatic way. In the late Bronze Age, a wide belt of related cultures stretched across much of Europe. This enormous cultural world had not yet broken apart into clearly separate Celts, Germans, Italics, Illyrians, or Baltoslavs. One important part of it was the Lusatian culture, centered between the Elbe, Oder, and Vistula. It was once often described as Slavic, but that view is no longer convincing. At that early stage, the ancestors of the Slavs were still embedded in a broader Old European setting. The people of the Lusatian culture may have represented one regional branch of that larger world, but not a fully formed Slavic ethnic community. A major transformation came with the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. The advance of Iranian-speaking Scythians from the southern Russian steppes disrupted older patterns across Central Europe. In the centuries that followed, new cultural formations emerged. Among them was the Pomeranian culture on the southeastern Baltic coast, followed later by the Belgrave culture, which spread through parts of the middle and upper Vistula basin and into neighbouring regions. These developments are often linked to changing relations between Baltic and Slavic ancestors, though certainty remains out of reach. Nearby, Germanic-associated groups developed west of the Oder, while Celtic peoples entered Central Europe from the southwest around the 4th century before Christ. Their arrival left traces not only in material culture, but also in language, where early Slavic borrowed certain terms from Celtic speech. By the 1st century before Christ and the 1st centuries after it, the Przeworsk culture occupied a large territory in what is now Poland and adjacent areas. Because this culture shows local continuity, and because some of its pottery resembles that of later early Slavic settlements, many scholars have tried to associate it with the Venedi and, through them, with the Slavs. Yet the evidence remains mixed. Strong Germanic influence are visible in burial customs, weapons, ornaments, and many aspects of daily life. For that reason, the Przeworsk culture is often seen as ethnically mixed, with Germanic elements stronger in some areas and possible Slavic elements stronger in others. It cannot be treated as a purely Slavic archaeological culture without forcing the evidence. Farther southeast, in the forest steppe lands of Ukraine, another important development took place. This middle zone between the northern forests and the southern steppe was especially suited to agriculture and long-term settlement. It formed a broad corridor around the middle Dnieper, the Pripyat, the Bug, and part of the Dniester. In the 2nd century before Christ, the Zarubintsy culture appeared there. Some researchers regard it as already Slavic, while others see it as Baltic or as a transitional formation between Baltic and Slavic worlds. Its people lived in small settlements on protected riverbanks, practiced farming, and were skilled in ironworking. Celtic influence can be seen in tools, brooches, and aspects of pottery. They cremated their dead and buried the remains either in urns or directly in the ground, a custom later known among Slavic groups as well. Still, the Zarabintsy culture cannot simply be equated with the Slavs. Its origins were mixed, drawing from Baltic, steppe, and Central European influences, and most of it disappeared by the 2nd century after Christ. Only in the more remote forest regions of the upper Dnieper did some of its traditions continue for several more centuries. By then, however, those lands were dominated largely by Baltic populations. This shows once again how difficult it is to trace one straight and uninterrupted line from an archaeological culture to a later people. In the 2nd century after Christ, a new and much larger cultural world emerged farther south, across the Ukrainian plains and as far as the Black Sea. This was the Chernyakov culture, one of the most important and debated archaeological complexes in Eastern Europe. It is known from hundreds of settlements, many of them laid out in long strips along rivers, and from numerous burial grounds, with both cremation and inhumation. Its pottery was often grey or black, carefully made and decorated with polished patterns. At the same time, simpler handmade wares also existed beside the finer products. Metalworking was highly developed and imported Roman goods such as coins, lamps, amphorae, and fine tableware reached these communities through trade or contact across the frontier. The Chernyakov world was not the creation of a single people. It reflected a broad and complex frontier zone where local populations, steppe groups, and peoples connected with the Gothic migrations all interacted. That mixed character makes it difficult to use as direct proof for early Slavic identity. Yet it remains crucial because it formed part of the wider environment out of which the Slavs eventually emerged into history. By late antiquity, the regions north of the Black Sea, around the Dnieper basin, and beyond the Carpathians had become a zone of intense cultural blending, movement, and transformation. Out of that long process, the Slavs gradually took shape, first as a linguistic community, and then as a historical force that would spread across much of Europe. One of the most disputed questions in early Eastern European history is the identity of the people behind the Chernyakov culture. This culture flourished during the age when the Gothic tribes held power across the southern Russian and Ukrainian steppes. And because the Goths had moved into these lands from the north through the Baltic regions during the 2nd century, many historians once treated the Chernyakov world as mainly Gothic. Others argued that its foundations had appeared before the Goths arrived, and had grown out of local Scythian and Sarmatian traditions already rooted in the region. Yet the material record reveals something more complex than either view alone. The culture contains traces linked to Thracian groups, to the Przeworsk sphere farther west, to the Zarubintsy zone in the forest steppe, and to eastern Baltic and Gothic elements moving southward. What emerged was not the work of a single tribe, but a broad political and economic system in which several populations participated, while sharing a largely unified way of life. Although some scholars have tried to connect the rise of the Slavs with this environment, the evidence remains incomplete. No solid proof shows that the culture of the earlier Slavs developed directly out of the Chernyakov world in a simple and uninterrupted line. The end of that world came suddenly. Around the beginning of the 5th century, settlements across the Chernyakov zone were abandoned, and many of them show signs of destruction. This violent break fits the arrival of the Huns, whose advance across the Volga and the Don shattered the tribal balance of the steppe and destroyed the Gothic power structure that had dominated the region. Under this pressure, the population connected with the Chernyakov culture was scattered, especially toward the south and west. What followed was a striking interruption in settlement across much of the former territory. This gap is one of the central problems in the story of early Slav origins. The clearly identifiable Slavic finds of the 6th century appear later, after this interruption, and the missing link between the two periods is difficult to reconstruct. A few early finds from the regions of the Prut, the Dniester, and the Bug may belong to the 5th century and show limited connections with the vanished Chernyakov tradition. But these remains are fragmentary. They do not prove full ethnic continuity. At most, they suggest that remnants of the older population survived and were gradually absorbed into a new ethnic formation that was only beginning to emerge. Across the wide lands between the Oder, the Vistula, the Dniester, and the Dnieper, the closing decades of the 4th century and the early 5th century marked the end of the older cultural world. The developed societies that had carried late Roman influences disappeared one after another. The Chernyakov complex faded away. The later Zarubintsy traditions, including the Kiev horizon, also came to an end. The Przeworsk culture broke apart as well. After a certain pause, a new and much simpler cultural pattern appeared. It had partial ties to some earlier local traditions, but it cannot be traced directly to any one of them. It represented something new, formed in a landscape where the remains of several older worlds had begun to blend. This new culture is recognized as the earliest archaeological expression of the Slavs. Its most striking feature is simplicity. Compared with the societies that came before it, this early Slavic world seems poor in luxury, plain in design, and modest in settlement structure. That simplicity becomes easier to understand when placed in the violent setting of the migration age. These communities were forming in a period of instability, movement, and social breakdown. There was little room for monumental building, elaborate burial customs, or finely differentiated material culture. In its earliest stage, this new way of life seems to have taken shape in the lowland belt between the eastern Carpathians, the Pripyat Basin, and the middle Dnieper. There, in the 5th to 7th centuries, archaeologists identify the Korchak horizon. The finds are concentrated largely along the southern tributaries of the Pripyat, though they extend eastward toward the Dnieper, westward to the western Bug, and southward to the Dniester. These settlements were usually small and placed along riverbanks or low terraces above the water. Often several were grouped close together, forming clusters of 3 or 4 communities. Their houses were sunken or partly sunken into the ground, usually square in layout and small in size, with a stone oven in the corner. They were practical shelters, built for use rather than display. The dead were cremated, and the ashes were placed in plain handmade urns or buried directly in the soil, sometimes under mounds and sometimes in simple flat graves. The pottery was coarse, undecorated, and shaped by hand. Metal finds are not numerous, but the objects that do appear, such as brooches, belt fittings, pendants, armlets, and simple rings, allow dating mainly from the 5th to the 7th centuries. Some hill forts later received Byzantine coins, showing that by the 6th century these communities had already entered wider networks of contact. The western counterpart to the Korchak horizon is known as the Prague type. Its finds stretch across the southern parts of Poland, eastern Germany, the lands of Bohemia and Moravia, Slovakia, and even into parts of the Danube basin in Austria. Only the southern fringe of Poland and perhaps the eastern edge of Slovakia can be treated as possible zones connected with the earliest homeland of these groups. In most of the rest of this territory, the archaeological picture reflects expansion rather than origin. During the transition from the 4th to the 5th century, major changes were taking place in the area once occupied by the Przeworsk culture in central and southern Poland. These changes were tied to the Hunnic advance into the Carpathian Basin. Older settlements and cemeteries disappeared. Roman traditions survived only in isolated and fading forms before being overwhelmed by the new political order created by the Huns. When Hunnic power collapsed in the middle of the 5th century, the path opened for the movement of Slavic groups from the east into these lands. They brought with them their distinct material culture: plain handmade pottery, semi-subterranean dwellings, and cremation burials. The dating evidence is limited, but the overall picture strongly suggests that this westward settlement began in the second half of the 5th century. A third major area tied to early Slavic development lay farther southeast, between the lower Dnieper and the Dniester, and in the basin of the southern Bug. Here, archaeologists identified what is known as the Penkovka horizon. Excavations revealed settlements stretched for long distances along rivers, with communities established on favourable terrain, much like those of the Korczak zone. The houses were similar in form, and the pottery was also handmade and plain, but its shapes show a stronger preference for sharply profiled and double conical vessels, recalling traditions from the northern forest regions. Metal objects are more numerous here, and some of them, especially brooches, make dating into the 6th and 7th centuries possible. At the same time, strong connections with the earlier Chernyakov world are visible, suggesting that the roots of this horizon go back earlier than its final archaeological form. In some places, remains of the Penkovka and Chernyakov traditions even appear side by side. This suggests that the communities who created the Penkovka culture lived in direct contact with the surviving population of the older steppe and forest steppe world. That contact likely began in the 5th century, when the former Chernyakov population was broken and dispersed, but not entirely erased. Because of this, some historians have proposed that the makers of the Penkovka horizon were linked in part to surviving Iranian-speaking groups, probably Sarmatians, who adopted Slavic language and customs and were remembered in 6th century sources under the name Antes. Medieval writers distinguish them from the Sklaveni, who may have represented a more purely Slavic branch, while still noting that both groups spoke closely related tongues. The political union of the Antes later fell under Avar pressure in the early 7th century, but the culture associated with them survived longer, and its spread toward the south suggests that these populations took part in the wider Slavic movement into the Balkans. Another cultural zone complicates the picture even more. In the forest regions of the upper Dnieper, across much of what is now Belarus and in the Desna basin down toward Kiev, archaeologists identified the Kolochin and Tushemlia horizon. The people of this zone lived in small settlements along rivers. Some houses were partly sunken into the ground, while others stood at surface level, supported by posts. Their pottery was simple, but differed in shape from that of the Korczak and Prague zones, including conical and softly profiled forms. Women wore bronze ornaments of Baltic character, often decorated with enamel. Their dress was fastened with a single brooch. Bracelets with widened ends and spindle whorls for spinning wool are common finds. Men wore belts with bronze fittings and used bows, arrows, and spears. Cremation remained the normal burial rite, with ashes placed in pits, urns, or undermounds. Because this horizon shares certain broad features with early Slavic culture, some scholars once connected it directly to the Slavs. They pointed to elements that later appear farther south in the Penkovka area and argued that this northern forest population may have formed part of the same world. Yet the evidence points in another direction. The roots of the Kolochin and Tushemlia horizon lie mainly in the Baltic Iron Age, though it also absorbed some influence from the older Zarubintsy tradition. It spread across lands where river names of clear Baltic origin are especially dense. Rather than developing directly into the Slavic world, It was eventually overlaid in the 8th and 9th centuries by later Slavic colonization from the south. For that reason, many scholars now view the inhabitants of the upper Dnieper basin during the 5th to 8th centuries as mainly Baltic, or at most mixed Balto-Slavic communities, rather than early Slavs in the strict sense. All of this leads to the larger question of when the Slavs actually emerged. The historical and archaeological evidence makes one point increasingly clear. The rise of the Slavs was not the continuation of a single ancient tribe that had simply gone unnoticed under another name. It was the result of a long and complex process of ethnogenesis. For centuries, the regions north of the Carpathians and west of the middle Dnieper had been occupied by mixed and overlapping cultural worlds. The Przeworsk, Chernyakov, and later Zarubintsy groups were not purely Slavic, but each contributed something to the formation of the new people that appeared in late antiquity. What matters most is not the attempt to label each of these earlier cultures with one ethnic name, but the recognition that they formed the background from which a new and distinct community developed. That process seems to have reached its decisive stage in the 4th and 5th centuries. The collapse of the older Roman period cultures did not simply leave empty space. It created the conditions for cultural and linguistic integration across a broad zone stretching from the middle Dnieper and the Pripyat to the upper Dniester, the Vistula, and the Oder. Within this zone, several older ethnic components interacted. Baltic influence was especially important, perhaps more important than earlier scholarship once admitted. To the west stood Germanic groups. To the east and southeast were Iranian-speaking peoples of the steppe. To the south, there were contacts with Celtic, Thracian, and perhaps Illyrian populations. Out of this frontier region along the margins of several larger Indo-European worlds, a new ethnic unit gradually formed. Language supports this picture. The Slavic languages are extremely close to the Baltic branch, more so than to any other Indo-European group. This has long suggested a period of close Balto-Slavic unity, or at least prolonged proximity. The distribution of ancient river names strengthens that view. Baltic hydronyms stretch surprisingly far south and east, even into areas that later became central to the Slavic cultural sphere. By contrast, the spread of securely Slavic place names becomes dominant later, especially during the early medieval centuries. This suggests that Baltic populations once occupied a much wider territory, and that the Slavic world emerged partly from within that environment. The role of the Baltic element in the rise of the Slavs was therefore probably fundamental. The existence of one common Slavic language across a vast area in the 6th to 9th centuries also points to a relatively recent formation. A people that had separated much earlier should have shown deeper linguistic division. Instead, the early Slavs appear in history with remarkable linguistic unity. That is one of the strongest arguments for seeing them as the youngest major branch of the Indo-European peoples of Europe. Unlike Germans, Celts, or Iranians, who can be followed much farther back in both archaeology and written testimony, the Slavs enter the historical record late and with sudden force. Their appearance is best explained not by ancient invisibility, but by late formation. This also helps explain the old problem of the Venedi. They almost certainly played an important role in the early stages of the process, even if they cannot simply be equated with the medieval Slavs. Their ethnic identity remains uncertain. They may have been a transitional population between Baltic and Slavic groups, or a broader organizational label used for communities living across a large northern zone. That uncertainty would explain why Roman observers were unsure how to classify them. Rather than seeing them as the Slavs in a finished form, it may be more accurate to treat them as part of the long developmental stage that preceded the final emergence of the Slavic peoples. By the 5th and 6th centuries, the process had reached completion. The Prague and Korczak horizon reflects a relatively unified material culture spread across a broad territory and linked to a population that had already acquired a shared language and a recognizable way of life. Once that expansion began, further change followed. As Slavic groups spread into Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Eastern Plains, they entered different political worlds, mixed with different neighbours, and gradually began to diverge. Over time, this led to the formation of the three major branches: Western, Eastern, and Southern Slavs. Later, in the Middle Ages, these branches developed into separate peoples and languages. The Slavs, then, were not one of the oldest visible nations of Europe, but one of the youngest to emerge as a clearly defined historical force. Their sudden rise after the middle of the first millennium can only be understood as the final outcome of a long process that took place in the centuries before. It was a process of blending, adaptation, collapse, and reformation across the forest steppe, and river basins of Eastern Europe. A strong Baltic foundation, shaped by contact with Germanic, Iranian, and other neighbouring peoples, gave birth to the early Slavic world. From that point, the Slavs moved outward with astonishing speed, carrying a simple but resilient culture into new lands and beginning a new chapter in the history of Europe. For many centuries, the lands that later became the Czech country were inhabited by peoples very different from those who live there today. Long before the Slavs appeared, these territories were occupied by Celtic and Germanic tribes, whose presence shaped the earliest history of Central Europe. Among the Celts, one tribe became particularly well known, the Boii. Their name would eventually give the region its lasting identity. The country that later came to be called Bohemia still carries the memory of those ancient inhabitants. The Boii settled in this region centuries before the beginning of the Common Era. Their political and cultural centre stood on the hill of Zavist, not far from the place where the city of Prague would one day rise. For generations they controlled the surrounding valleys and trade routes. But history rarely stands still. Around the beginning of the 1st century, Germanic tribes moving from the north and east began to push into the region. Among them were the Marcomanni and the Quadi. These groups gradually forced the Boii out of the Czech lands. The displaced Celtic tribes scattered in different directions, while the Germanic newcomers established their own presence in the region. Some of these tribes later moved further east into the territory of present-day Slovakia. It was there that the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius fought campaigns against them during the 2nd century. The Roman world stood close to the borders of these lands, but it never fully controlled them. Over time, other Germanic groups followed. Some came from the Elbe region, including the Lombards. A few of these settlers remained in the Czech lands long enough to witness the arrival of a completely new population. These newcomers were the Slavs. Strangely, no contemporary historian left a clear description of when or how the Slavs first entered Central Europe. The written sources that exist are brief and indirect. Byzantine authors such as Procopius and Jordanes described Slavic movements in southeastern Europe, but they provided little detail about events further north. The migration that would transform Central Europe took place largely outside the view of the writers of the time. Instead, the earliest stories about the Slavic arrival were preserved through oral tradition. For generations, they were passed from one storyteller to another before eventually being written down in the Middle Ages. One of the best-known versions was recorded in the early 12th century by the Prague chronicler Cosmas. According to this tradition, The land that would later become Bohemia was once covered by vast forests and wilderness, without permanent settlements. Into this empty landscape came a group of migrants led by a figure remembered as Father Czech. After a long journey, they reached a hill that rises above the surrounding plains. From its summit, they looked out over the valleys and rivers of the land and decided that this would become their new home. The hill known as Mount Jeep lies near the centre of the Czech country. Its shape stands out clearly above the surrounding fields, making it a natural symbol for such a legend. In the story, the leader of the tribe climbed to the top and chose the land for his people, just as the biblical Moses had once viewed the promised land from a mountain. The settlers then descended into the valleys and began building their homes. The chronicler who recorded this tale did not intend it as a myth alone. His careful language suggests that he believed the story preserved a distant memory of real events. The essential idea behind the legend is simple. The ancestors of the Czechs arrived from somewhere else and settled in a previously inhabited land, whose earlier history had already faded from memory. Medieval writers did not yet know that Celts and Germanic tribes had lived in the region before the Slavs. Those earlier inhabitants were rediscovered only centuries later, when scholars studied classical texts and archaeological remains. As a result, the medieval chronicle imagined the country as empty wilderness, waiting for new settlers. Later, writers tried to expand the story by suggesting where the Slavs might have come from. One chronicler of the 14th century connected the origin of the Czechs with Croatia. This did not mean the modern Balkan state, but rather a region known in early medieval tradition as White Croatia. It was believed to lie north of the Carpathian Mountains, in areas that correspond to parts of southern Poland and western Ukraine. From this northern homeland, the Croats were said to have divided into several groups. Some migrated south toward the Balkans, while others moved west toward the Czech lands. A related tribe, the Serbs, followed a similar path. Early medieval geographical records confirm that both peoples once lived far to the north before spreading into the regions, where they are known today. Such legends contain fragments of historical memory, but they cannot provide precise answers. For modern historians, the greatest difficulty is the lack of reliable written sources describing the earliest Slavic migrations. Many questions remained unresolved for centuries. A clearer picture began to emerge only when archaeology entered the discussion. The silent evidence buried in the ground revealed traces of settlements, tools, and pottery left behind by the early Slavs. Among these discoveries, one type of pottery proved especially important. During excavations near Prague, archaeologists uncovered simple handmade vessels dating from the early medieval period. Similar pottery soon appeared in excavations across Moravia, Slovakia, eastern Germany, southern Poland, and western Ukraine. Because the first discoveries were made near Prague, this style became known as the Prague type. These finds provided the first concrete proof of Slavic expansion across Central Europe during the time often called the Migration period. Unlike written chronicles, which offered only fragments of information, archaeological remains could reveal patterns of settlement and movement. Pottery alone does not tell the whole story. Archaeologists study the circumstances in which such objects are found. They examine burial sites, dwellings, tools, and traces of daily life. Together, these clues reveal how people lived, worked, and organized their communities. In burial grounds associated with the Prague type, the dead were usually cremated. The ashes were placed inside pottery urns and buried in shallow graves. Sometimes, small objects were included with the remains. These might include knives, clasps, combs, beads, or simple tools. In settlements, the same pottery appears among the remains of houses and everyday objects. Fragments of vessels are found scattered across the floors of abandoned dwellings, or mixed into the soil where structures once stood. By comparing these discoveries across different regions, archaeologists can trace the gradual spread of Slavic communities. Excavations in Moravia provided particularly valuable information. At burial grounds near Brno, it became possible to study layers of graves that accumulated over time. These layers demonstrated a clear connection between the earliest Prague-type pottery and later Slavic ceramic traditions. Another important discovery was made in southern Moravia, where hundreds of graves were uncovered together with the remains of a settlement, covering a large area. Such concentrations of population were rare. Most early Slavic communities were small villages scattered across the landscape. The objects found in these graves make it possible to date the settlements roughly from the late 5th century through the 7th century. This timeline is especially interesting because historical sources indicate that Germanic tribes were still present in some of these regions during the early phase of Slavic arrival. In the 5th century, the Rugi occupied parts of southern Moravia. Later, the Lombards moved into the same territory. Archaeologists identified their presence through warrior graves containing weapons and distinctive burial customs. One remarkable burial mound discovered near Brno may even belong to a Lombard ruler. Among the objects found in that mound were fragments of pottery closely resembling the Prague type. This suggests that Slavic settlers and Germanic inhabitants lived side by side for a time. Their cultures interacted and influenced one another, rather than immediately replacing each other. Such discoveries help explain how the Slavs gradually established themselves in Central Europe. In some places, they settled peacefully among earlier inhabitants. Both groups practiced farming and cattle raising, and the land was still sparsely populated. Under such conditions, coexistence was possible. Early Slavic houses were simple structures. Many were partially dug into the ground with square floor plans and clay floors. A stone oven often stood in one corner of the room. These modest dwellings formed small villages arranged around open spaces, where daily activities took place. Nearby pits served as underground storage areas for grain and supplies. Archaeological remains show that the inhabitants cultivated wheat, barley, rye, oats, millet, peas, lentils, and hemp. Such evidence demonstrates that early Slavic farmers possessed agricultural knowledge equal to or even more advanced than that of the earlier settlers. Across Central Europe, similar villages appeared during the 6th century. The spread of Prague-type pottery makes it possible to trace the direction of migration. The earliest finds occur in eastern Slovakia. From there, the pattern moves westward through Moravia and into Bohemia, eventually reaching the region between the Elbe and the Saale rivers. What the written sources never described in detail becomes visible through these discoveries. The Slavs expanded gradually from east to west, establishing settlements across Central Europe over several generations. Further north, a somewhat different pattern developed. In the territories between the Elbe, Oder, and Vistula rivers, Germanic tribes had once lived in large numbers. But during the 5th century, many of them migrated away. Some moved toward Britain, others towards southern Europe. As these lands became less densely populated, Slavic groups began to enter them. Here, they encountered the last remaining Germanic communities. The interaction between the two cultures produced variations in architecture and pottery styles that differ from those seen in the southern regions. In some northern settlements, houses were built above ground rather than partly underground. Pottery shapes also varied slightly, forming regional styles that later developed into distinct cultural traditions. By the end of the 6th century, Slavic tribes had reached the shores of the Baltic Sea. Place names across eastern Germany still preserve traces of their presence. Many Slavic communities remained there for centuries and left a lasting mark on the cultural landscape. Over time, the once unified Slavic world began to diversify. As communities spread across vast territories, differences in language and culture gradually appeared. From this process emerged three broad branches: the Eastern, Western, and Southern Slavs. Across the vast grasslands that stretch from the heart of Asia toward Eastern Europe, history has repeatedly been shaped by waves of nomadic migration. For thousands of years, these open plains formed a natural corridor, allowing mounted peoples to move across enormous distances. Time and again, these migrations followed the same path, advancing steadily from east to west. In ancient times, the first of these great movements were led by Iranian-speaking tribes, such as the Scythians and the Sarmatians. Centuries later, other nomadic peoples appeared, including Turkic and Mongolian groups whose armies thundered across the steppe. During the 4th century, the Huns surged into Europe. They were followed in the 6th century by the Avars, in the 7th by the Bulgars, and in the late 9th century by the Magyars, who eventually settled in the region that later became Hungary. Even after the medieval period began, these grasslands remained a route of invasion. Mongol raids in the 13th century devastated large areas of Eastern Europe. Despite their power and mobility, these nomadic empires rarely endured for long. Their warriors could conquer vast territories with astonishing speed, yet their populations were relatively small, and their economies were based largely on herding and warfare rather than agriculture or urban life. Once their initial strength faded, the nomads were gradually absorbed by the far more numerous farming communities living in the regions they had conquered. Only one of these steppe peoples managed to preserve a lasting national identity. The Magyars adapted successfully to European society and maintained their political independence, surviving as a nation and a state that continues to exist today. The Bulgars experienced a different fate. Although they founded a powerful state, they eventually merged with the Slavic population they ruled. Their name remained, but the people themselves became part of the Slavic world. The earliest migrations of the Scythians and Sarmatians took place long before historians can clearly identify the Slavs, either through written sources or archaeology. By contrast, the invasions of the Huns occurred during a period when the Slavic world was beginning to form. Because of this, historians often consider whether contacts may have existed between the Huns and early Slavic communities. The Huns themselves originated far to the east in Central Asia. Their early homeland lay beyond Lake Baikal, near the northern frontiers of ancient China. For generations they had fought along the Chinese borders before gradually turning westward. During the 4th century their advance gathered speed. Around the year 370 they crossed the Don River, and only a few years later they destroyed the powerful Gothic kingdom that had dominated the lands of modern Ukraine. The sudden collapse of Gothic power triggered a chain reaction across Europe. Entire populations began to move in search of safety or new lands. Visigoths and Ostrogoths retreated toward the Roman Empire. Other tribes followed, and within a few decades the continent was swept by the massive population movements, known as the Migration Period. These upheavals played a major role in the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. During the early 5th century, the Huns established themselves in the plains of Pannonia, an area corresponding largely to modern Hungary. From this central base, they launched campaigns in every direction. Their cavalry struck deep into the Balkans against the Byzantine Empire and pushed westward into Gaul and northern Italy. One of the most famous confrontations occurred in Gaul in the year 451, when Roman and Germanic forces halted Attila's army near the Catalonian plains. Although the battle stopped the Hun advance, their power was not immediately broken. Only a year later, Attila's forces approached Rome itself. According to tradition, the city was spared through the diplomacy of Pope Leo. The Hun Empire began to collapse soon after the death of Attila in 453. Without his leadership, the fragile coalition of tribes that formed his empire quickly disintegrated. Germanic peoples, who had previously been forced to submit, rose in rebellion and defeated the remaining Hun forces. By the middle of the 5th century, the once terrifying empire had disappeared. Memories of those violent years survived in later legends and epic poetry, including the famous medieval tale of the Nibelungs. Archaeology has revealed traces of Hun presence across parts of Eastern and Central Europe. Burial grounds in Ukraine and the Carpathian Basin contain skeletons with artificially elongated skulls. This distinctive practice involved shaping the heads of infants to produce an elongated form, a custom common among several nomadic groups. Similar skulls appear in some Germanic graves as well, showing how cultural influences spread during this turbulent period. Graves associated with the Huns also contained characteristic objects. Weapons often included powerful composite bows and arrows with distinctive triple-edged heads. Warriors were buried with short swords, curved blades, and richly decorated riding equipment. Saddles, belts, and harnesses were sometimes ornamented with gold or silver fittings. Another typical artifact of Hun culture was a tall bronze cauldron used in rituals or communal feasts. Women's graves sometimes contained mirrors and gold ornaments resembling those used in Eastern Asia. Despite these discoveries, the relationship between the Huns and the early Slavs remains uncertain. Some written sources mention conflicts involving a group known as the Antes, who lived in regions of present-day Ukraine. At that time, however, these people may still have been connected with Iranian steppe populations, rather than fully Slavic communities. Archaeological evidence also fails to show a clear picture of direct interaction. Much clearer evidence exists for later contacts between the Slavs and another nomadic people who followed the Huns into Europe. These were the Avars, whose arrival had a profound impact on the societies of the Danube region. The origins of the Avars remain a subject of debate. Various theories link them to Central Asian tribal confederations, or to groups known in Chinese sources. What is certain is that they appeared in Eastern Europe during the 6th century. Their warriors moved across the steppes, north of the Black Sea, and advanced rapidly towards Central Europe. By the early 560s, their armies had reached the mountain passes of the Carpathians and the plains of the Danube Basin. At first, they conducted raids into neighbouring territories, attacking regions under Frankish influence. Soon afterward, they joined forces with the Lombards and defeated another Germanic people known as the Gepids. This victory opened the way for the Avars to establish themselves in the Carpathian Basin. From this base, they built a powerful steppe empire stretching across large areas of Central and Eastern Europe. Their territory extended from western Hungary toward the Ukrainian plains and posed a serious threat to both of the major powers of the time. To the west stood the Frankish kingdom, while to the south and east lay the Byzantine Empire. The dominance of the Avars did not last forever. Their power began to decline during the early 7th century. A major uprising among the Slavic tribes of Central Europe weakened their control. At roughly the same time, other groups began to break away from their authority. Eventually, the Avar state was shattered through repeated wars with neighbouring powers. By the early 9th century, their political structure had collapsed, and the Avars disappeared from history as a distinct people. When they first entered the Carpathian Basin, the Avars were not a single unified tribe. Their forces consisted of many different groups bound together in a loose alliance. The core of their society may have numbered only a few tens of thousands. Alongside them lived numerous other peoples, including Slavic farmers, remnants of earlier Germanic populations, and communities descended from Roman provincial inhabitants. This diverse population created a unique cultural landscape. Archaeologists sometimes describe this period as a Slavic Avar cultural phase, because the two groups lived side by side for centuries. Their relationship combined cooperation, conflict, and economic dependence. Slavic communities cultivated the land and produced goods, while Avar elites maintained military power through cavalry warfare and tribute. Over time, these interactions produced a mixture of cultural traditions. Slavic nobles adopted certain elements of steppe, clothing, and equipment, while nomadic rulers relied increasingly on the labour and craftsmanship of the agricultural population. This blending created a distinctive material culture visible in metalwork, jewellery, and pottery. Excavations across Hungary and Slovakia have uncovered thousands of graves from this period. Burial goods often include decorated belts covered with bronze or silver fittings, shaped like leaves, animals, or mythical creatures. Some ornaments feature designs influenced by Byzantine art, while others reflect steppe traditions. These objects were likely produced in local workshops that combined many different artistic influences. Weapons and horse equipment found in the graves illustrate the military lifestyle of the Avars. Their warriors were expert riders who relied on swift cavalry attacks. They carried curved sabres, bows reinforced with bone plates, and arrows with distinctive shapes. Horses were sometimes buried alongside their riders, fully equipped with saddles and harnesses. Slavic warriors who fought beside them often used different weapons. Axes, spears, bows, and wooden clubs were common among Slavic infantry, though mounted fighters also existed. Their riding gear sometimes included spurs and other equipment not typical of steppe traditions. Women's graves reveal another side of this society. Jewellery made of bronze, silver, or occasionally gold included earrings, bracelets, rings, and necklaces of coloured glass beads. Many of these ornaments display strong artistic influences from Byzantine workshops, although most were produced locally. Large burial grounds discovered in Central Europe provide valuable information about the societies that lived there. One particularly important site revealed hundreds of graves covering the entire Avar period. Analysis of the skeletal remains shows a striking diversity of physical types, reflecting a population formed from many ethnic backgrounds. Only a small portion of those buried displayed the physical characteristics usually associated with steppe nomads. Other burial grounds discovered in southwestern Slovakia illustrate how closely Slavic and Avar communities lived together. The majority of graves belong to people who practiced cremation, a custom typical of early Slavs. Yet the same cemeteries also contained horse burials and objects associated with steppe warriors. These findings demonstrate that the populations were not strictly separated but interacted continuously. The archaeological record across the Carpathian Basin reveals this coexistence clearly. Slavic farming villages with semi-subterranean houses existed alongside nomadic encampments. Gradually, as time passed, the influence of settled life grew stronger and nomadic traditions faded. A similar cultural blending occurred further south among another nomadic group known as the Bulgars. These people originated from the steppe regions north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. During the 7th century, they moved toward the Balkans, where they established a state in cooperation with local Slavic tribes. The early Bulgars preserved many features of steppe life. They lived in circular tents known as yurts, and maintained a strong military organization. Their settlements included fortified camps that served as administrative and military centers. Some of these later developed into important towns. Burial customs among the Bulgars differed from those of the Slavs. Instead of cremating the dead, they buried bodies intact, often accompanied by weapons, jewellery, and offerings of food. In some cases, horses were buried together with their owners. Archaeological finds also reveal traces of steppe religious beliefs through animal bones and symbolic objects placed in graves. Over time, however, the Bulgars increasingly adopted Slavic culture. As their state developed, Slavic language and customs spread among the population. Eventually, the two groups merged so completely that the name Bulgar came to describe a predominantly Slavic people. A comparable process occurred in the eastern regions of the Slavic world under the influence of another nomadic power, the Khazars. These Turkic tribes built a powerful state across the steppes north of the Caucasus during the 7th century. Their influence extended across wide territories and affected many Slavic communities living along the great river systems of Eastern Europe. Trade played an important role in these contacts. Major river routes connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Byzantine world. Merchants transported furs, wax, honey, and other goods southward, while luxury items, metalwork, and spices travelled northward. By the 9th century, these networks helped stimulate the formation of new political centres among the Slavs. Contacts with powerful neighbours such as Byzantium and the Frankish Empire encouraged the gradual emergence of organised states. The Slavs who settled across Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe did not live in isolation. Their lands lay between two of the most influential powers of the early medieval world. To the east stood Byzantium, heir to the eastern half of the Roman Empire. To the west rose the Frankish realm, which expanded rapidly under ambitious rulers. These two empires shaped the political and cultural development of the Slavic peoples for centuries. Their influence reached deep into the territories settled during the migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries, helping transform scattered tribal societies into the foundations of the medieval states that would later emerge across Europe. Long before Christianity spread across Eastern Europe, the Slavic peoples followed a rich and complex spiritual tradition rooted in the ancient Indo-European world. Their beliefs shared distant connections with the religious systems of many early civilizations, including the peoples of India, Iran, Greece, Rome, the Celtic lands, and the Germanic north. Certain ancient words reveal these connections. Terms used by the Slavs to describe divine spirits or supernatural forces resemble similar words found in several Indo-European languages. Even the Slavic word for a god echoes related terms used in older cultures stretching from India to the Caucasus. Among many Indo-European societies, one of the most powerful and respected deities was the god of thunder. The Slavs also honoured such a figure. His name was Perun, a powerful sky god associated with lightning, storms, and the destructive force of thunder. Early writers from the Byzantine world compared Perun to the great gods of other cultures such as Zeus among the Greeks, Jupiter among the Romans, and Thor in the Germanic world. Despite these parallels, Slavic religion was not simply a reflection of foreign traditions. The Slavs developed their own spiritual ideas and local cults, and these beliefs could vary widely from one tribe to another. Compared with other ancient European religions, however, much less information has survived about the spiritual life of the early Slavs. This absence of detailed records does not mean their beliefs were less important or less complex. The problem lies elsewhere. The Slavs entered the written history of Europe relatively late. Unlike the Celts and the Germanic tribes, whose customs were described by Roman authors, the Slavs had no historians observing them during the earliest stages of their development. When they finally appeared in historical records, Europe had already become largely Christian. Writers from the Christian world showed little interest in understanding the religious traditions of pagan societies. Instead, their primary goal was to convert these peoples to Christianity as quickly as possible. As a result, many early reports about Slavic paganism were incomplete or distorted. Some accounts were written by observers who had only second-hand information. Others came from later chroniclers, who lived centuries after the old beliefs had begun to disappear. These writers sometimes misunderstood ancient customs and filled the gaps with imagination or speculation. Early legends describing the lives of saints in Central Europe mention pagan shrines, idols, sacrifices, and magical rituals, yet they rarely record the names of specific gods. Their descriptions remain vague, offering only scattered glimpses of a religious world that was already fading. Even so, the persistence of old traditions can be seen beneath the surface of Christian society. Church authorities in Central Europe frequently issued orders banning pagan rituals and condemning magical practices. These repeated prohibitions reveal that ancient beliefs continued to survive quietly among the population, long after official conversion had taken place. In many parts of Central and Southern Europe, the spread of Christianity gradually replaced the old religions so completely that little direct evidence remains today. Among the Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, and many South Slavic peoples, the original spiritual traditions survived mainly in fragments of folklore. Songs, seasonal rituals, and rural customs preserved faint echoes of ancient beliefs, but most of the religious system itself vanished. More detailed information survives in regions where the old religion endured longer. Among the Eastern Slavs, chronicles from medieval Rus recorded several important traditions. Additional descriptions appear in reports written by travellers from the Islamic world who visited the lands of Eastern Europe. These accounts provide valuable clues about rituals, burial practices, and sacred customs. Another important source of information comes from archaeological discoveries. In recent decades, excavations have revealed ancient shrines, sacred places of sacrifice, idols carved from wood or stone, and objects used in ritual ceremonies. Graves from the pagan period often contain personal possessions, such as weapons, tools, jewellery, and vessels filled with food or drink. These items were placed beside the dead as offerings intended to accompany them into the next world. Burial customs themselves changed over time. In earlier periods, the Slavs commonly cremated the bodies of the dead and placed the ashes in urns. Later, under the growing influence of Christianity, burial of the body without cremation became more common. Certain objects found in graves carried symbolic meaning. Eggs represented the idea of life and rebirth. Coins placed in the mouth or hands of the dead served as payment for the mythical ferrymen who guided souls across the waters of the underworld, a tradition that also existed in ancient Mediterranean cultures. Archaeology has also confirmed the existence of darker beliefs. Some graves suggest a fear of the restless dead. Individuals believed to return from the grave to harm the living. Bodies suspected of such behaviour were sometimes mutilated or pinned down in order to prevent them from rising again. Another ritual recorded by travellers involved the burning of widows on funeral pyres alongside their deceased husbands, a practice that appeared in several early cultures. Many everyday objects were decorated with protective symbols, believed to possess magical power. Weapons, pottery, jewellery, and tools were often marked with signs such as crosses, sunwheels, swastika patterns, and star-shaped symbols. These markings were intended to protect the owner and ensure success in daily activities, such as farming, hunting, or warfare. Despite the disappearance of the old religion, traces of it still survive in modern folk traditions. Seasonal celebrations connected to the cycles of nature preserve echoes of ancient rituals. Winter songs performed during the darkest days of the year recall ceremonies marking the return of sunlight. In springtime, symbolic figures representing death or winter are carried out of villages and destroyed. Bonfires lit during midsummer festivals reflect ancient celebrations of the sun at the height of its power. At the center of Slavic religion stood a pantheon of gods connected to the forces of nature. The most widely known among them was Perun, the thunder god whose cult was especially strong among the Eastern Slavs. In the 10th century, his idols stood near the city of Kiev and also in sacred places close to Novgorod. Evidence suggests that his worship spread across many Slavic lands. Another important deity was Svarog, a god associated with the bright sky and the life-giving power of the sun. His name appears to be connected with ancient words meaning heaven or celestial light. In some traditions, Svarog was accompanied by a divine son known as Svarojic, who represented the sacred fire of the earth. Fire itself was seen as a living presence, a reflection of the sun's energy brought down to the world of humans. A third major figure in the Slavic pantheon was Veles. He was linked to cattle, agriculture, and the prosperity of herds. Farmers and shepherds regarded him as a protector of their livelihood. In some regions, his memory survived only in old sayings and expressions long after his worship had disappeared. Beyond these widely known gods, many others existed, whose influence was limited to particular regions or tribes. Among the Eastern Slavs, there were deities associated with wind, fertility, and mysterious supernatural forces. Some of these figures appear to have been influenced by neighbouring cultures, from the steppes or from distant eastern lands. In the lands along the Baltic coast, pagan traditions survived longer and became particularly elaborate. Here, the temples and rituals of the Slavic tribes attracted the attention of chroniclers from neighbouring Christian kingdoms. One of the most famous sacred centres stood in the territory of the Deities, where a great temple served as a place of prophecy. Priests interpreted signs believed to reveal the future, especially regarding harvests and the outcome of wars. A sacred horse played a central role in these rituals, and its movements were believed to carry messages from the gods. Another legendary deity worshipped along the Baltic coast was Svantovit. His temple stood on a high promontory overlooking the sea. According to descriptions preserved in medieval accounts, the idol of this god had 4 faces and held a ceremonial drinking horn. Each year, priests filled the horn with wine and examined its level to predict whether the coming harvest would be abundant or poor. Svantovit was regarded as one of the greatest gods of the northern Slavs. Offerings were sent to his temple from distant regions, and prisoners captured in battle were sometimes sacrificed in his honour. The sanctuary itself was protected by a large force of warriors, who guarded its treasures and ensured the safety of the sacred place. The temple complex stood within strong defensive walls and formed the centre of a fortified town. Inside the shrine, a massive wooden statue towered above the visitors. Sacred objects surrounded the idol, including weapons, ceremonial equipment, and a magnificent sword. A white horse dedicated to the god was kept within the sanctuary and used in rituals of prophecy. Archaeological research has attempted to locate the remains of such temples. In several cases, excavations have uncovered foundations and traces of ancient structures that may correspond to these legendary sanctuaries. However, erosion, destruction, and centuries of human activity have often erased the exact locations of these sacred sites. Despite these difficulties, many smaller places of worship have been discovered. These sites often consist of circular or oval areas marked by shallow ditches. Within these spaces, archaeologists have found evidence of ritual fires, wooden idols, and offerings left by worshippers. Such sanctuaries appear to have served local communities rather than entire tribes. Some shrines stood near water sources such as lakes or springs believed to possess supernatural power. Others were located on hilltops or mountains whose dramatic landscapes inspired feelings of reverence. These natural features became sacred places where people gathered to honor the gods, offer sacrifices, and perform seasonal ceremonies. Idols representing the gods were carved from wood, stone, or occasionally metal. In some cases, the figures were simple and rough, while others displayed more elaborate craftsmanship. Several wooden statues discovered in northern Europe depict male or female deities, with strongly emphasized physical features connected to fertility. Stone carvings have also been found, showing gods holding horns, weapons, or other symbolic objects. Some statues possess multiple heads, a feature that may have represented the vast power or far-reaching vision of the deity they depicted. Multi-headed gods appear in several Slavic traditions and may reflect older Indo-European ideas about divine strength and cosmic authority. Small figurines discovered in graves or settlements also played a role in religious practice. These objects might represent protective spirits, sacred animals, or symbolic companions of the gods. Horses in particular were strongly connected with divine power and warfare. Amulets shaped like horses, fish, or serpents were believed to bring protection and good fortune. Over time, the old religion began to weaken. Social changes transformed Slavic society, and the spread of Christian culture introduced new political structures and ideas about the organization of the world. Conversion did not occur peacefully everywhere. In several regions, pagan uprisings broke out against rulers who attempted to introduce Christianity. Yet gradually, the new faith expanded, supported by powerful neighboring kingdoms and empires. In Eastern Europe, remnants of the old beliefs survived for centuries in remote regions. Along the Baltic coast, resistance lasted even longer. Some tribes fought fiercely to preserve their traditional religion and independence. Eventually, however, military campaigns launched by Christian powers broke their resistance. Across much of Europe between the 6th and 8th centuries, large populations of Slavic peoples spread into new lands. They formed a vast cultural community that shared language and customs. Yet politically, they remained divided into many separate tribal groups. This fragmentation made it difficult for them to withstand organized powers around them. Nomadic groups moving across the Eurasian steppe posed a constant threat, while powerful states such as the Frankish realm in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east sought to expand their influence. At times, attempts were made to unite these tribes under stronger leadership. One of the earliest examples was the short-lived realm associated with the leader Samo. His authority emerged during resistance against Avar domination, but once he died, the alliance quickly dissolved. In the early centuries of Slavic settlement, there was little need or opportunity to create permanent states. Communities organized themselves mainly through tribal alliances that adapted to local conditions. When those circumstances changed, the alliances often disappeared just as quickly. By the 9th century, however, conditions across Central and Eastern Europe began to shift. Slavic settlement had largely stabilized. Agriculture and trade were expanding, and communities needed stronger defenses against external pressure. Out of these circumstances, more permanent Slavic states began to appear almost simultaneously across several regions. In Central Europe, the most powerful among them was a state centered in what is now Moravia, known historically as Great Moravia. This state emerged during the early 9th century, not long after the collapse of Avar power, following the campaigns of Charlemagne. Great Moravia stood directly in the path of Frankish ambitions to expand eastward beyond the Danube toward the Carpathian region. Because of its strategic position, the state soon attracted the attention of chroniclers from Western Europe, as well as observers in Byzantium. Written accounts from the period describe the rise of a ruling dynasty that transformed Moravia from a loose tribal territory into a structured political entity. The earliest figure clearly associated with this transformation was Moimir. In the early decades of the 9th century, he consolidated power by incorporating neighbouring territories, including the Principality of Nitra. The ruler of that region, Pribina, had maintained close ties with the Frankish world, but Mojmir expelled him and absorbed his lands, strengthening Moravia's political unity. During this period, Christianity had already begun to spread into the region through Frankish missionaries connected to the bishopric of Passau. Yet Moravian leaders soon recognized that religious dependence on Frankish clergy could bring political subordination as well. Moimir's successor, Rastislav, therefore pursued a different path. Seeking independence from Frankish influence, he requested the creation of an autonomous church structure within Moravia. When his appeals to Rome did not produce the result he hoped for, Rastislav turned to the Byzantine Empire. In the early 860s, he requested missionaries who could preach the Christian faith in the Slavic language. The Byzantine emperor and the patriarch responded by sending 2 learned brothers from Thessalonica, Constantine and Methodius. Both men were familiar with Slavic speech from childhood. Their homeland had long been surrounded by Slavic communities. Constantine, later known as Cyril, was an accomplished scholar, while Methodius had experience both in administration and in monastic life. Before travelling to Moravia, they prepared carefully for their mission. Constantine devised a written script capable of representing the sounds of the Slavic language. This alphabet, known today as Glagolitic, allowed religious texts to be translated and read in the language spoken by the people. The introduction of worship in the Slavic language represented a remarkable innovation for medieval Europe. Religious services throughout the continent were normally conducted in Latin or Greek. In Moravia, however, liturgy and scripture began to appear in a language ordinary believers could understand. The change proved enormously popular and strengthened the cultural independence of the Moravian state. Not everyone welcomed these developments. Frankish clergy viewed the growing influence of the Byzantine mission with suspicion. Political rivalry between Moravia and the Frankish realm intensified the conflict. After the death of Constantine in Rome, Methodius continued the mission alone, but faced opposition and imprisonment from rival church authorities. Despite these struggles, the Moravian state reached the height of its power under Prince Svatopluk. During his reign, the kingdom expanded widely across Central Europe. Frankish rulers were eventually forced to recognize Moravian independence through diplomatic agreements. For a time, Moravia dominated territory, stretching from the Elbe River in the west to the Upper Bug in the east, and from the Danube northward into the Carpathian lands. Yet this period of strength did not last. Internal disputes and religious conflicts weakened the state after the death of Methodius. His followers were expelled, and the use of the Slavic liturgy was suppressed. Many of his disciples sought refuge elsewhere, especially in Bulgaria, where their work would have lasting consequences for Slavic culture. After the death of Svatopluk, Great Moravia entered a period of decline. In the early 10th century, invasions by the Magyar tribes delivered the final blow. Archaeological discoveries have played a crucial role in reconstructing the story of this early Slavic state. Written records often describe impressive fortifications and settlements, but provide few precise details about their location. Excavations along the Morava River have revealed large, fortified complexes that match those descriptions. One of the most remarkable sites lies near modern Mikulčice. Here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an enormous fortified centre covering a vast area. Originally a small settlement, it developed over time into a complex network of fortifications, residences, workshops, and churches. Stone walls and timber structures protected the central stronghold, where the ruling elite lived. The surrounding settlements housed craftsmen and farmers, whose homes were built mainly from timber. Archaeological finds indicate advanced metalworking and jewelry production. Spurs, tools, ornaments, and finely decorated metal fittings demonstrate the presence of skilled artisans and a thriving economy. The discovery of numerous stone churches at the site reshaped earlier assumptions about the architecture of Great Moravia. Historians once believed that early churches in the region were made primarily of wood, and that stone construction appeared only after the arrival of Byzantine missionaries. Excavations proved otherwise. At Mikulčice alone, the remains of more than a dozen churches have been identified, each with different architectural forms including rotundas, basilicas, and cross-shaped structures. These buildings reflect a mixture of influences. Some features resemble architectural traditions from Bavaria and the Carolingian West. Others suggest inspiration from the Adriatic coast or the Byzantine world. Yet the final designs show distinctive local adaptations, revealing how Moravian builders combined diverse traditions into their own style. Another major centre of the Moravian realm developed at Stare Miesto. Archaeological work has revealed a dense settlement surrounded by agricultural villages and craft workshops. Churches, cemeteries, and residential quarters formed a large urban complex that likely served as a key political and cultural centre of the state. Beyond the Moravian core lands, other Slavic regions were undergoing similar transformations. In the territory of present-day Slovakia, the Principality of Nitra became an important centre of power. Its ruler, Pribina, initially maintained friendly relations with the Frankish world and permitted Christian missions to operate in his lands. After Mojmir expelled him, Pribina found refuge under Frankish protection and eventually ruled a new domain in the Pannonian region, near Lake Balaton. There he founded a fortified settlement known as Mosapurk. This site developed into an active centre of Christianity and administration. Churches were built, missionaries arrived, and trade flourished. Archaeological research has identified the location of this settlement near modern Zalavar in Hungary, where remains of fortifications, churches, and cemeteries have been uncovered. Meanwhile, along the Adriatic coast and in the Balkans, Slavic tribes were forming their own political structures. Croats and Serbs emerged as distinct groups in this region. Their territories became a contested frontier between the Frankish Empire and Byzantium. Over time, the Croats gravitated toward the cultural sphere of Western Europe, while the Serbs remained more closely tied to Byzantine traditions. Further east, another powerful Slavic-influenced state was rising. In the Balkans, the Bulgarian Empire emerged through the interaction between Turkic Bulgars and local Slavic populations. Under strong rulers such as Khan Krum and later Tsar Simeon, Bulgaria expanded dramatically and became one of the dominant powers of Eastern Europe. The Bulgarian court encouraged the development of Slavic literature and religious culture. After the expulsion of Methodius's disciples from Moravia, many found refuge there. Their work led to the development of new written traditions and eventually to the creation of the Cyrillic alphabet, which became the foundation of writing systems used by many Slavic peoples. While these developments unfolded in Central and Southeastern Europe, the Eastern Slavic lands were also undergoing major changes. Vast river networks linked the forests of the north with the wealthy civilizations of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Traders, adventurers, and warriors travelled these waterways, forming connections that would shape the future of Eastern Europe. Among those travellers were Scandinavian groups known as Varangians. Moving along the river routes, they encountered Slavic communities already developing regional alliances. Rather than imposing rule by conquest alone, the newcomers often integrated themselves into local political structures. One of the most important centres to emerge along these trade routes was Kiev. Located on the Dnieper River, it became a crossroads of commerce linking northern forests with the markets of Byzantium. Over time, Kiev developed into the political and cultural heart of a new state, known as Kievan Rus. Early rulers expanded their authority by uniting surrounding tribes and securing trade routes. Contacts with Byzantium brought new cultural influences, including Christianity. After periods of conflict and negotiation, the Christian faith eventually became firmly established in the region. Under rulers such as Vladimir and his successor, Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus reached a peak of prosperity. Monumental churches, administrative institutions, and flourishing trade transformed Kiev into one of the great cities of medieval Europe. Craftsmen, merchants, and scholars contributed to a vibrant urban culture shaped by both Slavic traditions and Byzantine inspiration. By the middle of the 10th century, Strathclyde stood near the end of its long independent life, though not yet wholly erased. The old British kingdom had already been weakened by repeated attacks, and Norse power was becoming a major reality in the West. That shift is crucial. It helps explain why certain districts that had once belonged securely within the Strathclyde orbit became contested or transformed. Cumberland itself passed through changing hands and changing loyalties, while Galloway increasingly felt the pressure of Scandinavian dominance. The old notion that Galloway had been a kingdom in its own right throughout these centuries does not survive close examination. Geography, politics, and the surviving record all point another way. First, it was part of the Roman frontier world. Then, it belonged within the sphere of Strathclyde. Later, it came under strong Norse influence and, for a time, Norse rule. Only afterward was it absorbed fully into the expanding Kingdom of Scotland. The habit of pulling it out of that sequence and treating it as a permanently separate realm has caused endless confusion. The line of Strathclyde kings shows the continuity of the kingdom more clearly than any theory can. Whatever uncertainty remains around individual names and dates, the broad fact is unmistakable. A kingdom with its own remembered rulers endured there for centuries. It was not an occasional rebellion under English masters, nor a mere province waiting to be handed from one neighbouring king to another. Its rulers fought, allied, lost ground, regained influence, and survived deep into the early medieval period. Galloway shared in that history because it lay within the same larger political body. The capture of Alclwyd in the 8th century by a combined enemy force stands as one of the great shocks in that history. It was not the fall of a trivial stronghold. It took the pressure of two powerful rulers acting together to break into the heart of the kingdom. Even then, the blow didn't instantly erase Strathclyde, but it weakened it enough to make later Norse inroads easier. In that sense, the path toward the Scandinavian domination of Western districts, including Galloway, was being prepared well before the final collapse of the old British order. Once this sequence is kept clear, the historical picture becomes much more coherent. The Sea Raiders, wrongly called Saxons by some Roman and later writers, were in large measure Norsemen. The Angles were a distinct and influential people whose northern character shaped much of England. The Jutes were not a vanished footnote, but part of the wider Scandinavian border world, whose traces remained strongest in the north and east. Bernician and Northumbrian power in Scotland was real, but often overstated. Strathclyde was a true kingdom, not a political illusion, and Galloway belonged within that kingdom until later transformations, not beneath an ancient and continuous Anglo-Saxon rule. After the reign of Elphin, the succession in Strathclyde continued through rulers, whose names survive only in scattered traditions. Yet the line itself remained unbroken enough to show that the kingdom was still alive. Conan, son of Rurach, appears next and is remembered as a king of the Britons, dying in the early 9th century. He was followed by Artag, or Arlaga, under whom later writers claimed that an English king had overrun Strathclyde and planted settlements there. That claim does not stand firmly. Raids and devastation are easy to believe, but permanent settlement is another matter. The record does not convincingly show that Strathclyde was broken or colonised at that stage. On the contrary, the kingdom clearly remained independent for decades afterward. Its greatest danger came not from that quarter, but from across the Western Sea. In the later 9th century, Alcluyd, the fortress city at the heart of the kingdom, was attacked by the Danes, operating from Ireland. The siege lasted for months, which already says much about the strength of the place and the importance attached to it. When the stronghold finally fell, the invaders ravaged the surrounding land and carried many captives back to Dublin. Yet even this was not the immediate end of the kingdom. The attack weakened Strathclyde badly, but it did not erase it. The Norse assaults of this period were often devastating without instantly becoming full colonisation. They shattered confidence, drained manpower, and damaged royal authority. But the political body itself could still stagger on. Artag was killed amid these struggles, and his son Rune followed him. Around this time, the kingdom appears under a Welsh name, meaning the Welsh of Strathclyde, which is important because it shows how contemporaries still recognised it as a distinct British realm. In the same general period, a Danish force moved south from Northumbria and plundered as far as the district later known as Galloway, ravaging that land as well as other parts of the Strathclyde sphere. These attacks must have deepened the kingdom's weakness, but they still belong to a phase of violent pressure rather than orderly replacement. Rune left a son named Eochaid, though for a time another figure, Grig, seems to have acted as guardian or governor, and may even have taken power into his own hands. Later tradition credited him with recovering southern districts and with freeing Galloway from the rule of the Angles. That story is difficult to accept in the form it was handed down. The district south of the Solway was not truly part of Strathclyde in the way later writers imagined, and Galloway was not living under a settled Anglian yoke from which it needed dramatic liberation. Such language belongs more to later reconstruction than to the realities of the time. By this stage, the deeper struggle in the southwest was not one between Galloway and English masters, but between the older British population, the incoming Irish Scots, and the wider Norse pressure reshaping the western coasts. This is where one of the most important turning points in the history of Galloway appears. In the later 9th century, the old British population of the southwest, linked to the broader Cymric world, seems to have been pushed aside decisively. The evidence points to a major displacement, rather than a slow and peaceful blending alone. The native element did not vanish in an instant, but the balance changed. Those who would not submit to the new order were eventually driven out or chose to leave. Their flight survives in traditions that tell of men of Strathclyde abandoning their country and seeking refuge in Wales. This was not a random wandering of broken people. It appears to have been the final stage of a longer crisis created by conquest, pressure, and demographic change in the southwest. The district most clearly involved in that process was Galloway. The older British inhabitants there had already been under strain for some time. Irish Scots from Ulster had been crossing in increasing numbers and establishing themselves across the district over generations. At a certain point, that movement stopped being only immigration and became domination. There is even a tradition that the decisive settlement in Galloway was secured by stratagem and violence, with leading local men being slain. Whether the details are exact or not, the broader picture is convincing. The old Cymric population of Galloway was forced into retreat, and many of those who refused subjection fled south and west, eventually finding room in Wales where they were settled in districts, recovered from Saxon pressure. That exodus matters enormously because it helps explain several otherwise confusing traditions. It shows why the British identity of Strathclyde remained strong in name while weakening in territory. It also explains how Galloway, once within the orbit of the British kingdom, gradually ceased to be British in character. The new dominant element there was Irish Scot, brought from Ulster over time. This change did not happen in 1 year, but by the late 9th century its effects had become clear enough to force a decisive migration of the older population. The situation in Cumberland was related, though not identical. There too British populations were suffering under repeated pressure, but the driving force was more directly Norse. Cumberland and Galloway were both destabilised, yet by different combinations of enemies. In Galloway, the Irish Scot advance was central. In Cumberland, Scandinavian power became more decisive. Donald was followed by another Donald, and then by a ruler remembered under forms such as Eugenius, Owen, or Ewan. During his reign, southern chroniclers began making grand claims about English overlordship across almost all Britain. One English king was said to have been chosen as father and lord not only by Scots and Northumbrians, but also by the king and people of the Strathclyde Welsh. Such statements are classic examples of inflated political language. They tell more about English royal ambition and literary style than about actual command over the northern kingdoms. Temporary submission, diplomatic acknowledgement, or strategic agreements might well have occurred. But that was not the same as real absorption. The men of Strathclyde did not cease to have a king, nor did their kingdom dissolve into England, because an English chronicler framed an event in the loftiest possible terms. The same exaggeration appears again and again in southern records. Kings are said to have subdued entire peoples, only for those same peoples to resist, recover, or fight again a few years later. The pattern is familiar. A raid, a victory, a treaty, or a forced acknowledgement becomes, in English narrative, universal submission. The reality was usually much less complete. This is especially clear in the case of the North, where Scots, Cumbrians, Danes, Northmen, and British kings remained active powers rather than obedient subjects. The later kings of Strathclyde continue to prove that the kingdom still mattered. One Donald died in the mid-10th century and was followed by another ruler, whose name survives in forms closer to the old British tradition. In his reign, the kingdom was still capable of campaigning eastward and fighting major battles against the northern Scots and Picts. In one such encounter, Strathclyde forces defeated their enemies and killed a leading ruler. That is not the action of a dead state. It shows a kingdom that, though weakened, still possessed real military force and political ambition. The reverse came not long after, when the same Strathclyde ruler was defeated in battle by the northern Scots and Picts, and then withdrew to Rome, where he died. Such a fate gives the period an almost tragic character. The kingship still existed, but its strength was fading. The kingdom could strike, but it could no longer sustain its older power. It had become reactive, exposed, and increasingly hemmed in by stronger neighbours and by the long consequences of earlier invasions. The final king is remembered as Eochaid, sometimes called the Bald. He appears in connection with the Great Wars of the early 11th century, and was still alive at the time of the famous Battle of Carham. When he died, the independent line of Strathclyde effectively ended. The kingdom that had once been one of the major powers of post-Roman northern Britain was gone. With its collapse, Galloway passed more fully into the hands of the Norsemen, while Cumberland, on the other side of the Solway, was under the same broad Scandinavian influence. This was the true aftermath of Strathclyde's fall, not the simple inheritance of the district by one neighbouring king or another. At this point, later writers created yet another confusion by trying to turn Galloway into an ancient independent kingdom of its own. Some even invented kings for it at an impossibly early date. One chronicler speaks of a king of Galloway attending an English royal display in the 10th century, as though the district already existed by that name as a separate sovereignty. The problem is not merely that the evidence is weak. It is that the statement collides with everything else known about the region. Galloway was not yet standing alone as a clearly defined kingdom with its own long line of rulers. It was part of the larger Strathclyde world, later, overtaken by Norse power and only afterward shaped into the political form familiar from medieval history. It is that the statement collides with everything else known about the region. Galloway was not yet. The story of English kings receiving homage from northern rulers is another field where exaggeration and confusion piled up quickly. One chronicler lists named rulers, another lists a different set, and the oldest record gives only a number without any names at all. Later, writers expanded the scene into a theatrical display, turning a diplomatic gathering into a symbolic pageant of universal submission. In one version, the King of Scots, the ruler of the Cumbrians, island lords and others rode an English king in triumph along the River Dee while he held the helm. It is a striking image, but the more dramatic the story becomes, the less trustworthy it appears. The whole tone belongs to royal glorification, not sober historical reporting. Even where a kernel of truth survives, it was almost certainly something narrower. A local settlement, a treaty, or the holding of a contested district on certain conditions could later be stretched into language of total overlordship. The case of Cumberland is a good example. What may have been a grant or recognition tied to one border region later became, in inflated retellings, the submission of whole peoples and kingdoms. Once again, the language of conquest outran the fact. The weakness of these later narratives becomes even clearer when they begin to attach names like Galloway too early, or create royal titles that do not fit the political geography of the age. Some of these writers lived centuries after the events they described and had no direct knowledge of the places in question. They wrote from monasteries far from the southwest of Scotland, relying on earlier fragments, misunderstanding local names, or simply reshaping the past into something more orderly and impressive. When these inventions were repeated by later historians without close scrutiny, they hardened into supposed facts. Another source of confusion came from similar-sounding names in Irish material. Terms that referred to mixed peoples or foreign Gaels in Ireland were later misunderstood as references to Galloway. This is a serious error. Words that look like they point to the district may in fact belong entirely to Irish conditions and Irish political geography. When such mistakes are carried back into Scottish history, they create false links and imaginary kingdoms. What makes the problem worse is the general style of many medieval chronicles. They habitually magnified the prestige of kings, especially English kings, and turned limited political arrangements into sweeping claims of supremacy. A treaty becomes submission. A raid becomes conquest. A temporary ally becomes a permanent vassal. This habit must be remembered constantly when reading narratives about the North. Without that caution, every English advance begins to look final, even when the kingdoms supposedly subdued are found fighting independently soon afterward. The case of Strathclyde shows the truth more clearly than any theory. Its line of kings continued for centuries. Its capital was attacked, taken, and retaken in memory. Its armies fought major battles. Its people migrated, resisted, and endured. Its districts, including Galloway, were transformed by pressure from Irish Scots and Norsemen rather than simply handed from one English king to another. The kingdom's end came through long attrition, not through a single act of southern mastery. After Strathclyde collapsed, a darker and less clearly recorded phase begins in the history of Galloway. This is the period when Norse influence becomes unmistakable and, in all probability, dominant. The silence in the sources has tempted many writers to fill the gap with easy assumptions, but the material evidence and the wider pattern of Western history point firmly toward a substantial Norse occupation. The castles along the coast were not built merely for passing visits. The strategic sites, the maritime logic, and the broader Norse control of neighbouring seas all suggest something much stronger than occasional raiding. Galloway was too valuable, too exposed, and too closely linked to the roots between Ireland, Man, the Hebrides, and the Solway to escape serious Scandinavian rule. To understand that development properly, the wider northern world has to be kept in view. The Scandinavians were not an accidental late force appearing out of nowhere in the British seas. Their maritime skill, their shipbuilding, and their habit of long-distance movement had deep roots. Ancient writers already knew of powerful northern peoples, whose ships were unlike those of the Mediterranean world. Early confrontations between the Slavs and their western neighbours began long before the final conquest. During the reign of Charlemagne, wars and alliances both occurred between the Frankish Empire and Slavic tribes living east of the Elbe. At times, Slavic groups even fought alongside the Franks against common enemies such as the Saxons. A decisive turning point came in the early 10th century. When Henry the Fowler became King of Germany, he launched campaigns that pushed German authority eastward. Within a few years, his armies captured key Slavic centres, including Brandenburg. Several tribal groups were forced into submission, including the Wallachians, the Abodrites, and numerous Sorbian tribes living between the Elbe and the Saale rivers. Henry's successor continued this expansion. New frontier fortresses strengthened German control across the region. A powerful noble named Gero extended these territories even farther east, reaching rivers deep within Slavic lands. Alongside military expansion, missionary bishoprics were established along the frontier. These religious centres aimed to convert the local population and integrate the region into the Christian political order of the empire. Yet Slavic resistance did not disappear. In the late 10th century, a major uprising broke out after German authority weakened during conflicts in southern Europe. Slavic forces destroyed many German fortresses and expelled rulers from large areas between the Elbe and the Oder. Christian institutions collapsed across much of the region as tribes restored their traditional religious practices. During this period, new leaders attempted to rebuild political structures among the Slavs. One notable ruler was Gottschalk of the Abodrites. Raised as a Christian, he tried to unite his people into a stable state along the Baltic coast. His plan aimed to create an independent Slavic principality, while maintaining diplomatic ties with the German Empire. For a time, he worked with church leaders to introduce Christianity peacefully among his subjects. These efforts ended violently when a pagan uprising broke out during the 11th century. Gottschalk was killed and many of the tribes abandoned Christianity once again. Only years later did his son Henry manage to restore control and rebuild the Abodrite state. After Henry's death, the region entered another period of instability. Danish influence grew along the Baltic coast, while internal divisions weakened the remaining Slavic powers. Leadership was eventually shared between rival rulers, including Pribislav and Niklot. Their territories became the focus of renewed military campaigns organised by neighbouring Christian rulers. In the mid-12th century, a crusade was proclaimed against the pagan slaves of the Baltic region. Noble families from Saxony and other German territories joined the campaign, motivated both by religion and by the opportunity to acquire new lands. Although the crusade itself achieved limited military success, it marked the beginning of a long process that ultimately ended Slavic independence in the region. Gradually, the remaining rulers accepted Christianity and recognized the authority of powerful German princes. Fortresses fell, alliances collapsed, and the remaining Slavic territories were open to settlement from the west. Colonists moved into the region, towns expanded, and over time the Slavic population became absorbed into the emerging German society. The final stronghold of Slavic independence in the Baltic region was the island of Rügen. This island contained one of the most important religious centres of the Slavic world. Its temple, dedicated to the god Svantovit, served as both a spiritual and political focus for surrounding tribes. In the year 1168, Danish forces conquered the island and destroyed the temple at Arkona. This event marked the symbolic end of organised pagan resistance among the Baltic Slavs. In the centuries when Scandinavian expansion reached the British Isles, Norwegian settlers played the leading role in shaping many of the northern regions. Their presence extended across Scotland, Ireland, and large parts of northern England. By the time the Norman conquest transformed England in the 11th century, the population along much of the eastern coastline, particularly around York and Lincoln, had become heavily Scandinavian in origin. These communities were not simply small groups of raiders who passed through the region. They were settlers who left lasting marks on the land, its language, and its customs. Ireland offers another revealing example of how these northern settlers behaved after they established themselves. The Norwegians and Danes who arrived there often fought among themselves for control of territory and trade routes. These struggles resemble the pattern already familiar in Irish political life, where rival chiefs frequently competed for power. Over time, the Scandinavian settlers adopted elements of the local culture, and their conflicts began to resemble those of the Irish themselves. Yet, despite this blending of habits, their material culture remained distinctive. Weapons discovered in Ireland from this period often display clear Scandinavian craftsmanship and are frequently superior to locally made examples. Swords discovered in archaeological finds range from about 2 to nearly 3 feet in length, sometimes double-edged and sometimes single-edged, usually equipped with a guard and a large pommel at the end of the hilt. These weapons reveal the skill and martial traditions that the northern warriors brought with them. The Scandinavian influence also reached deep into the linguistic and cultural fabric of northern Britain. Observers have long noticed that the traditional speech of the Scottish lowlands bears a striking resemblance to the languages of Scandinavia. Sailors from Scotland who had been shipwrecked on the coasts of Norway or Jutland were reportedly able to communicate with local people surprisingly easily. This similarity suggests that the languages once shared a close relationship before centuries of change altered them. In fact, the everyday speech of the lowlands preserved many words and expressions of Scandinavian origin, sometimes even more than the dialects spoken in northern England. The cultural connection did not stop with language. northern England and the Scottish lowlands both preserve traces of Scandinavian heritage in traditional songs and folklore. These similarities are especially noticeable in Scotland, where large numbers of Northmen settled over time. The language of Iceland provides another clue to these historical ties. Icelandic developed in relative isolation and preserved many features of early Scandinavian speech. When it is compared with older forms of Scottish language, the resemblance becomes clear. Differences in spelling and pronunciation exist, but the underlying structure often remains close enough to show how easily the two could once interact. Some writers have suggested that the poetic traditions of Scandinavia contributed to the distinctive character of Scottish verse. The wild and dramatic tone found in many Scottish traditions may partly reflect this northern heritage, intensified by the presence of Celtic culture. Music offers another example. Certain Scandinavian musical patterns resemble those preserved in Scottish folk music, suggesting that the traditions of the north helped shape the soundscape of medieval Scotland. A remarkable trait of the Scandinavian settlers was their ability to adapt quickly to the lands they entered. Wherever they settled, they often adopted local customs and sometimes even abandoned their original language in favour of the speech of the surrounding population. Yet, even when they assimilated in this way, they tended to preserve a strong sense of identity. Their symbols and traditions continued to appear long after their arrival. One of the most famous of these emblems was the Raven Banner, a symbol carried by northern warriors for centuries. It inspired fear and superstition across the British Isles and remained in use long after many Scandinavian rulers had converted to Christianity. Eventually, the symbol was replaced by the heraldic lion, a figure that later appeared in the coats of arms of several Scandinavian kingdoms. The lion emblem became a lasting sign of royal authority in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Scandinavian rulers had converted to Christianity. Eventually, the symbol was replaced by the heraldic lion, a figure that later... The earliest reference to Scandinavian raiders appearing in the waters around Britain come from early medieval chronicles. These sources describe ships arriving from the western coast of Norway. Irish and Welsh records place their first major raids on Irish shores near the end of the 8th century. These accounts describe attacks on monasteries and islands, including sites in the Hebrides and on the Isle of Man. Monastic communities were particularly vulnerable because they possessed wealth but little defence. By the early 9th century, the raids had intensified. Settlements were soon established along parts of the Irish coast. Important religious centres such as Iona suffered repeated attacks. Within a few decades, Scandinavian influence had become so strong that major cities like Dublin fell under Norse control. By the middle of the 9th century, fleets of Scandinavian ships filled the waters around Ireland, transforming the political and economic landscape of the region. At roughly the same time, Norwegian kings were expanding their authority across the islands of the North Atlantic. The Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and several other island groups were brought under their influence. Norse leaders also pushed northward along the Scottish mainland. Regions such as Caithness and Sutherland fell under Scandinavian control, and their rulers extended